Okay.
Yeah, we got some cheeky little customers for you to guess this week, Ben.
They do sound cheeky.
Naughty little frogs.
Quite a diverse sort of mix of sounds in that call.
Yeah, as far as I know, they're all one species.
Yeah, you got that little like squelchy noise. You've got the more sort of rattly one.
Yeah, the one that's like a cheeky little chuckle.
Gosh. Do I get any sort of clue?
I think, as we do sometimes do, the episode itself, the sort of topic of the episode could be considered a clue, where we're going, where we're traveling to.
Okay. So it's some sort of...
For those listening, we're going to Hungary.
European frog.
Yes. If you want, you can ask me one question and I'll tell you an honest answer. And see if that helps you guess.
Oh my days.
Because you're behind in this game. It's 3-2 to
me. Is it at least not a rana species?
It is at least not a rana species. Yes. It's not in the genus Rana. It might have been once, quite possibly, but not now.
It barely helps me. I'm going to go with the fire-bellied toad, right? They're a that side of Europe sort of species, are they not?
I'm sorry, I stopped it there by mistake for a second, but it's back. The frogs are back.
Yeah, fire-bellied toad is what I'm going with.
Oh, fire-bellied toad is a good guess. No, it wasn't the fire-bellied toad. It was, in fact, the marsh frog, Pelophylax ridibundus.
Have we not had that one before?
I don't know, probably. Who am I? Am I to remember every frog we've ever had before? Jesus, not my role.
That's true. That's true.
Are you systematically excluding all frogs that we've ever had before? Then,
because
I feel like
absolutely.
Also...
I've never. Of course, I remember every frog we've done.
That's a barefaced lie, and no, you were wrong. Unfortunately, I mean it was a hard one. They're all hard ones, but yeah, this is the marsh frog. So this is this widespread European species. We do have them in the UK. They're not actually native to here. There are sort of introduced species, but we do have some small populations. But yeah, they're found pretty much everywhere else in Europe. Not everywhere, but like a long, long list of countries. They're extremely widespread frog. Yeah, they just seem to be sort of everywhere. They're considered to be the safest frog in terms of extinction in the whole of Eurasia because they're generally found in large populations.
Well, that's good.
Broad
that's
range.
Good for them.
Yeah, broad range, and the range is growing because they're successfully introduced by people in different places.
I was expecting you to say something along the lines of they're the safest frog in Eurasia because they have absolutely no ability to harm you or anybody. Even their prey, it's a 50-50 that they're totally fine as they're being eaten.
I back myself against any frog worldwide to not be a threat to me.
Oh, that's. I think your arrogance is misplaced. There are many frogs that could kill you very quickly. All they need to do is sneak up you in the night and just crawl into your open mouth, and next thing you know, you're dead.
Look, if your best means of attacking and killing me is by climbing into my mouth while I'm asleep, I can tell you right now, you're not bound for success.
You got to sleep sometime. And there's a lot of
yeah, I do.
That's all I'm saying.
So what? So the frog knows it's going to meet its fate. It's going to meet its maker, but it has to do it because it knows that it will. Okay, fine.
Yeah,
but yeah.
Worthy cause.
Nevertheless, these are a widespread species. I think the noise is really nice. They're quite a big, chubby frog with sort of. They're like brown with mottled, darker brown patches, and then they have this really, really nice bright green stripe from the nose all the way to the tail. High quality frogs.
And safe.
So let's move on. We're not talking about frogs all day. We're going to be talking about snakes. So this is a paper by Wenner, Moore, Radovics, Bancic, Budaj, Rak, Kovacs, subalks, cursors, and mizai, 2025. The smooth snake is not a threat to the meadow viper. Predator-prey interactions of a reptile specialist snake, published in Community Ecology. So we're talking about the Hungarian meadow viper. That's Vipera ursini racosiensis.
A very stark contrast to the safety of the marsh frog, right? This is a snake which is desperately endangered, or at least the subspecies is, right? What would I think there was somewhere popping up 9,000 individuals? Is
and it's thought that might be
somewhere in the paper.
Yeah, and that might be a massive recovery. It could have been down a lot lower in the past.
Yeah, because I mean there has been a lot of targeted conservation effort for these meadow vipers, right? And it's
enormous
ongoing,
amounts, yeah.
As this paper is sort of suggesting too, with efforts to try and uncover what causes trouble for them.
Exactly. And this meadow viper is found in the steppe meadows of the Carpathian Basin, so it's kind of like grassland plains that generally lack closed forests. So it's quite open, grassy environments, and that's where these snakes are found. And the Hungarian meadow viper looks like a classic European viper, zigzag down the back, quite small, browns and greys in colour, doesn't get longer than 50 centimetres. And there's also the other snake in this study, which is being investigated as a suspect for being a predator of Hungarian meadow vipers, and that is the smooth snake, which is non-venomous. Again, quite a small species, but they're found all over Europe. We get them in the UK.
Just about.
Just about, with a sort of Western distribution range limit, and they also go as far north as like Norway. But yeah, they're reptile specialists, or they're considered to be reptile specialists. They eat other reptiles. And so you've got this Hungarian meadow viper, which has had massive conservation efforts, like you said. And predation by native wildlife is thought to be one of the major threats to this species. So native predators like the European badger, the red fox, some avian predators like the buzzard and short-toed eagle are all eating this species. And this is a species which is inhabiting like essentially pasture land almost. Like a lot of it is just short grass and much of it is grazed by cattle and stuff. There's like
I feel like we
management.
covered. Did we cover a paper where they experimentally altered the grazing intensity and had like a mowed lawn comparison? And it was the sort of more patchy sort of grazed areas were better than the aggressively mowed areas. I'm not sure if it was. I think they were hoping to find meadow vipers. They didn't find enough to make a decision whether it was better or not. But they found a lot more lizards and things
in the ones.
I can't remember exactly the findings, but was this something we covered at some point?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was. We did do it. We did it not that long ago, but neither of us can remember the full story. But yeah, it was something along the lines of like cows grazing was better than just mowing, and yeah. I remember it being quite a surprising positive for cows.
Yes, I think that's yes.
But these authors wanted to essentially, it's a very simple mission. This paper. Let's work out whether or not the smooth snake is a threat to the Hungarian meadow viper. So, smooth snakes, like I said, generally considered reptile specialists. And there are studies which detail them eating vipers, including other members of the genus Vipera, which the Hungarian meadow viper's in. So, there is a smoking gun to suggest that they might like the odd little sneaky, tasty treat. But they wanted to find out whether or not that was the case for these ones co-inhabiting the steppes here with the meadow viper in Hungary, and we'll see if it's a threat to the population of meadow vipers. And so they studied the diet to see what was in the poo. It all boils down to poo. They did this the old-fashioned way by collecting a bunch of snakes, hanging onto them till they pooed, and then closely examining the poo in a microscope to see what kind of scales and other remains were in the poo, and work out by that what they'd been eating and the proportions of what they'd been eating within their diet as well.
Yeah, it's quite sort of broad strokes is what they were going for, because, you can imagine something that's been digesting in a snake for quite a while loses a lot of the distinct characteristics that enable you to identify it to species level. So
it does. Yep. It all gets digested
for
down.
broad groups here, because you should be able to sort of pick out vipers in amongst other prey items. And you know if it's a viper,
Yeah.
it's going to be a meadow viper.
Yeah, the vipers have got quite unique scales that you can pick out. And they managed to get poo. They caught 85 smooth snakes. They got poo out of 53 of them. Some of them just didn't need to go, but they got a lot of poo regardless. And the diet was overwhelmingly lizard based. There were also, which surprised me a little bit,
65%
maybe
plus
because
was
yeah,
lizards.
yeah, and this is like green lizards, wool lizards, sand lizards. But what I was surprised to see was that there were also quite a small amount, but still not an insignificant amount of beetles and grasshoppers in the diet.
For the smaller snakes, right? It's sort of
I think
it was one of those
yeah.
classic. I don't know. To me, it seems to be suggestive of some ontogenetic, as in shift with age, in diet, as the larger snakes tended to have less invertebrate prey in their diet, and that's when the mammals started popping up as well. Was the smaller snakes didn't have any mammals, the largest snakes had a higher proportion of mammals. So it does seem to be a slight age-driven shift in diet, but lizards all the time.
Yeah, but what about snakes?
No snakes, right? Well, yes, there were snakes. No vipers.
No vipers, but there was one case of a snake eating a snake, and it was a smooth snake which actually cannibalized another smooth snake. So a large adult male ate a smaller smooth snake, and that is quite well documented in this species. You know, they'll eat other smooth snakes if they find them. And so I guess this is quite good news, really, at least in terms of meadow viper conservation, because they essentially discovered that smooth snakes are not a major predator of the meadow vipers. And they also did some occupancy stuff, looking at where the snakes were found. Yeah, looking at where the snakes were found, you know, across this large sort of grassland environment. They had little plots, and they were trying to determine what sort of increased the likelihood of a particular species of snake being found. And the main thing which increased the likelihood of finding a smooth snake was lizard prey species, but they didn't seem to be related to whether or not the meadow vipers were there, which would kind of suggest that they were a resource.
Yeah, this nice co-occurrence of the smooth snakes and their sort of primary prey, and that doesn't seem to be interacting with the meadow viper occupancy, which is great. So they're sort of partitioned in space and potentially not interacting in a predator-prey environment as well. So you can sort of not have to worry, it seems.
Yeah, they're probably more like they're competitors, but they're not really necessarily preying on each other.
Right. But even competitors,
so snakes,
you know, if they're not occupying the same space, the competition is somewhat, you know, muted too.
Yeah. So the smooth snakes
it's competitive exclusion, and they chase all the vipers away. And the reason that they don't co-occur is because they've eaten all of them, but a long time ago. So it's not in the current, fecal samples.
Maybe, yeah. It seems less likely.
That's a bit of a stretch.
Explanation. Yeah, but yeah. So smooth snake, despite being a reptile specialist predator in central Hungary, their dominant prey is lacertid lizards, and so yeah, the meadow vipers need not worry too much, which is great. And just fun to talk about another little European viper species, which we are going to continue doing, Ben, aren't we? Because we've got another paper here about similar but different. So we are going from the meadow viper to the asp viper. And this is a paper by Dubey, Zwahlen, Mebert, Monney, Golay, Ott, Durand, Thiery, Kaiser, Geser, Ursenbacher, 2015, Diversifying Selection and Color-Biased Dispersal in the Asp Viper, published in BMC Evolutionary Biology. So this one's slightly different, and there's a really nice picture in the YouTube video which is from the paper, of these two color morphs of asp viper. So this is Vipera aspis.
Very
and we're
different
talking about
morphs, like dramatically different morphs.
Yeah, really, really different. So you've got the blotched morph, which is essentially, I mean, it's not quite black and white, but it's very contrasting colors.
It's very close.
Like light,
yeah,
black and white, or light, like black and light grey, or dark grey, light grey, and it's essentially a really contrasting pattern where you've got a light black background, a light background color, and on top of that you've got very dark blotches. So it is extremely bold when you look at it in isolation, but it probably does help it camouflage. And then you've got the other morph, which is just basically a patternless snake almost. It's just plain sort of mid-brown. Sometimes they have a stripe along the spine, but they're generally pretty much just plain brown. So they're very different looking snakes. I mean, if you showed me naive of this like polymorphism, these multiple color varieties existing in populations, I would think those were two different species of snake.
Oh, easy. Right.
They look
That's
completely
absolute
different.
slam dunk. Because it's not like one's a color variation, like, oh, one's darker, or even with the, you think of like Vipera where you've got the zigzag, and you've got some individuals that have weaker or stronger zigzags, or almost negligible zigzags. This is, there's almost not a common color between the two of them. It's quite
totally.
remarkable.
They're completely different. And, you know, people are familiar with snakes having different color morphs. In captivity, obviously, lots of color morphs can pop up and humans can select for them using selective breeding. But many species have these natural multiple color morphs. And it is quite common in snakes. And it seems to be even more common among vipers, I would say, perhaps due to their kind of sit and wait life strategy, leaving them exposed a lot of the time. But, you know, I think it's fair to say it's common in a lot of snakes, but it does seem to be very, very striking in vipers. That's just my observation, but yeah. And we are looking at this asp viper, which is another really neat little viper from southwestern Europe. And there are some benefits that are kind of already known to having multiple morphs. So having multiple colors in your population means that as a whole, the species can inhabit a wider variety of niches. They can go to different places and find themselves a home. They also seem to be more resilient to environmental modifications. So if you've got a species with lots of different color morphs, there are multiple options to fall back on when something changes. So say somebody cuts down all the trees, maybe the dark green snakes will die, but the bright green ones that match grass, as an example, could still persist. So you've got more options evolutionarily. You know, even if you lose one, you've got another one. And they also might have different kind of skills and attributes in different environments too. And one of the ways in which they can be
a niche breadth thing, right?
Yeah, totally, man. Yeah, it's exactly what it is. Yeah. And one of the ways in which that kind of manifests itself is when moving between habitats. So certain color morphs may be more obvious or less obvious to predators, which could mean that some morphs are more or less likely to die when they're moving. And if you're less likely to die when you're moving, so you're less conspicuous when you're slithering around, you're more likely to survive into a new area. And then that can mean that you're more likely to persist and spread. And therefore, that might be something which we could pick up in the genetics of these snakes, right? Like, okay, this thing is more prevalent in this area. And then you can start to look at why that might be and test whether or not nature is selecting certain colors. And they did that in this paper by comparing the color differences. So looking at which color variety these snakes were in seeing how they were represented in different populations of asp vipers. So you've got all these different little populations with different amounts of different colors. And then they used genetics. So the way they did that was they used these kind of neutral genes that don't affect survival. They're just like random genes. And they looked at the kind of differences in those like neutral genes that don't really have any effect on anything. And they wanted to compare those genes to see whether or not they were bigger or less big than the differences in color. So you've got these random meaningless genes. Are the changes in these genes that occur between populations more or less dramatic than the colors that are represented? And if the color differences are bigger than the random genetic differences, then you end up that natural selection is probably playing a role. So natural selection is choosing something about these colors which are allowing the snakes to survive better or worse. So essentially,
right. So what you're saying there is when you're saying differences in color, is that's genetic differences in the areas that are coding for those colors?
No. So they were just comparing whether or not these neutral genes were more different, had more variety than the color mutations. So I think they were using color to compare against neutral genetic information. That was my understanding. I may be wrong about that.
But color in this sense is a binary blotched, non-blotched, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So yeah, they're looking to see about this variety. And essentially, what they found through their genetic investigations was that the color in vipers may be influenced by natural selection and movement patterns. So the genetic signatures that they looked at suggest that blotched vipers are actually moving more than plain ones because they're more likely to survive moving. So there's kind of more relationships between neighboring populations in blotched snakes than non-blotched ones, which suggests it's the blotched ones that's moving. If that makes sense? Does that kind of better explain the
others that
genetic
are
component?
remaining sort of where they are, leading to this they're less related to other instances of that same color type, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what they also found was that you've got this situation where the blotched ones are moving around more. So dispersal is kind of more prevalent in the blotched ones, which suggests they're more likely to survive when they set out to move. They're probably better camouflaged. But the opposite side of that is that the non-blotched types, so the plain ones, they're mostly found in the dead center of the study area where their solid color helps them blend in with these like open rocky habitats. So it's likely that being plain brown in these open habitats where it's rocky probably protects them from visual predators. So you've got this kind of duality where the blotched ones are really good travelers, but the plain ones are really good at just sticking around and surviving. And because of that, you've got these kind of isolated areas in the center of the range where the plain morph persists massively and kind of explodes. But when it comes to actually dispersing and moving to different habitats, they're not as good. So they're kind of stuck where they are.
Right, which is explaining why you still get both of these morphs existing, right? You almost have these two different, I suppose, complementary sort of forces that are leading to this. They do highlight in the discussion that it might not necessarily be a dispersal thing, but a survival a difference, that the non-blotched individuals may not be surviving in these sort of what appears to be the sort of outer areas. So it might not be dispersal, it might be sort of differential survival, but the result is the same, right? That you have the more blotched individuals out and about. But it's that's hard to unpick without knowing individual histories of the animals.
Yeah. But, one thing that you're kind of almost touching on there is this diversifying selection, which is where like selection favors the extreme morphs, right? So like,
yes, right.
You're more likely to survive if you're very blotched, like really contrasting blotched, or if you're really plain. Like
you've got to pick one of these strategies.
Yeah, an intermediate animal, which is like semi-blotched but mostly plain, is probably conspicuous in both the wrong ways and can't disperse, can't camouflage. And so you end up with this selection. Because I always found that weird to think about. Is like, you've got these pit vipers which are like dramatically different colors, but they're the same species. Where are the intergrades? And as it turns out, the reason there aren't intergrades probably is largely due to the fact that the intergrades just aren't as good at surviving as the extreme versions. And they call that diversifying selection.
Got, two different strategies. And if you're not fully committed to one, you're going to fall somewhere in the middle and it's going to be a sort of sad compromise. And Yeah.
And one last thing they touch on is that this asp viper is an extremely widespread species and it's capable of dealing with a lot of different habitat types. So it ranges from like Mediterranean coastal areas all the way to alpine regions up to 2,500 meters. And part of the reason for this dramatic success might be the fact that it has all these color polymorphisms, because you can also get black ones. Right. There may be others as well. But there are lots of
and just having that sort of that innate variation is going to help, you get thrown into a different environment or whatever, or environment changes on you. At least you've got somewhere quite an easy switch for some of the individuals to fall into a morph that ends up being more beneficial. And that, yeah.
So there we go. Asp vipers, if you're splotchy, you can go moving around and travel with impunity. But if you're plain, you got to stay put in the rocks. Otherwise, you'll be toast.
And commit to staying put in the rocks.
Yeah, but just a really nice study design and something really cool to actually determine some of the benefits of being these different mutations and try and kind of explain why you actually get wild snakes with different color morphs.
And that persist as opposed to just gravitating all towards one that's better. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Cool. So
excellent.
Have you got any other business for this week, Ben?
I don't know. That's all I've got in terms of chatting about meadow vipers and asper vipers and smooth snakes. Very snake heavy, but good.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great stuff. Cool. All right. Well, that's it for us. If you want to get in touch with us, you can herphighlights@gmail.com, or you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at herp_highlights. I'm on Instagram at Tom_E_major. If you want to support the podcast, you can patreon.com/herphighlights. Thanks as always to all of our patrons, legends, and thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for listening.